This is things I wish I could say in Sunday school. I want to share some thoughts and ideas that are different than what we usually hear. My goal is to be really honest rather than inherently faith-promoting. I hope these ideas may spark some interesting discussions with your friends, families, or classes. Please enjoy. This is the lesson for January 13th through 19th and 20th through 26th. Joseph Smith History, verses 1 through 65, and Doctrine and Covenants, section 2. Today's topics are the term first vision, 4 different versions, and Joseph Smith history as a narrative. The main topic this week is Joseph Smith's first vision. I have always found the term first vision odd. I always just think, really? No one could come up with better terminology? When I think of a vision, it's something that you see rather than necessarily truly experience. There is a good amount of visionary precedence in the Bible, and Joseph Smith uses the term vision throughout Joseph Smith history. I'm always just surprised because vision, at least to me, means that you saw it rather than that it was something real your whole body experienced. Then the word first doesn't give a lot of description. It means there are more visions, and this was the earliest. But that's all we get out of the word first. So for something that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints uses as its foundation, I think all the time about the terminology of first vision and the weakness of those words. I think I would have termed it God's visitation or something like that, maybe add the year if it needs to be distinguished further. Anyway, it's always been a pet peeve. There are 4 different written descriptions Joseph Smith gave of the first vision. The most known is the 1838 account that is Joseph Smith history. The manual states, although these accounts differ in some details depending on the author, audience, and setting, they are otherwise consistent. I think that is way overstating it. The author is always Joseph Smith. The scribe recording it may differ, but the author is the same. And the audience is always someone wanting to hear the truth. All of these 4 accounts are available on lds.org and the Gospel Library app, but the link in the manual only takes you to apologist explanations for the multiple accounts. You have to go to the Gospel Topics essay on First Vision accounts in order to find the links to the actual sources. That's where I read them this week. I'm going to give a quick rundown. The first written account was done in 1832, 2 years after formally establishing his church. Joseph Smith was writing an autobiography. It was never published. Some things that stand out from the 1832 account are that Joseph said he was 16 years old. Joseph only mentions seeing the Lord. He does not mention 2 beings. The Lord's message emphasized forgiving Joseph's sins. This account doesn't mention churches. The next account is from 1835. This was written by a scribe as Joseph related his first vision to a visitor to Kirtland. This time, Joseph says he was about 14. He saw 2 personages, one after the other, and then angels. The next account is from 1838, and it's the Joseph Smith history version. And the 4th account is from 1842. It's part of the Wentworth letter, which also contained the Articles of Faith. It's pared down, but largely consistent with the 1838 version. Reading through all of these, the thing that I thought was the most confounding is that only the 1838 Joseph Smith history version mentions anything about feeling like Satan was going after him before God appeared. That's significant. Yet, it didn't emerge until 1838. I just don't see him writing his biography in 1832 and not mentioning the feeling of some dark being overtaking him before seeing God. That bothers me more somehow than saying Joseph Smith saw the Lord rather than God in Jesus Christ. I'm not a historian. There are much better resources out there if you want to dig into this history more. Now I'm going to talk about the narrative of Joseph Smith history. This was written in 1838, 8 years after organizing the church, almost a decade after the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith had a long time to hone his story. To me, that is by far the simplest and most plausible reason for the big differences in the first vision accounts. The 1842 story is consistent. There are other written accounts of Joseph's followers writing down the story of his first vision, but they are after the 1838 version. They are much more consistent than the 2 earlier versions. One of the things that stood out to me in Joseph Smith history is the persecution complex. It starts right after his vision. Joseph says that he tells people what he saw and they start persecuting him, even though he's just a boy. But there's no written accounts corroborating this. People, especially ministers, kept journals. A local boy claiming to see God would have made it in a journal, especially if they were mistreating a minor and needed to justify that in their own minds. I just don't see it happening the way he wrote it at all. I also think it's really interesting that he didn't name the Methodist preacher in verse 21. Yet, he later names Professor Charles Anthon. He would definitely remember the name of the Methodist preacher who dressed him down about having a vision. I think the best explanation is that by omitting the name, people cannot fact-check the account. They can't impeach Joseph Smith's personal narrative. The next thing that stands out from Joseph Smith history is his admitting to personal faults. It feels manipulative. He doesn't get specific at all. He admits to being guilty of levity and associating with jovial company. This is all to deflect that he was defrauding people, claiming to be able to find buried treasure. He thinks that by admitting he's not perfect, that will make him look honest in his refuting the numerous accounts of his money digging that he briefly acknowledges in verse 56. But he denies any serious sins or wrongdoing. Joseph Smith wrote this in 1838. He had begun practicing polygamy in secret at this point. So far, it's just one additional wife, Fanny Alger, who was 14 and lived in his home when he began his relationship with her. An exact marriage date is not known, but historical data points to 1834. His polygamy really takes off in 1841. I just think it's important to note what Joseph Smith was really doing when he wrote Joseph Smith history. It admits to being guilty of levity. The last thing I'll discuss today are the scripture quotes during Moroni's visitation. It is completely preposterous to me that someone would remember exact quote differences in multiple scripture passages delivered verbally in the middle of the night 15 years in the past. It's just ridiculous. But I can see how citing scriptures that allude to Joseph Smith's claimed divine mission might feel like it was bolstering his narrative. I probably used to feel that these scriptures pointed to Joseph Smith being a prophet, but now I see him quoting them 8 years after founding his church as a construction of a narrative. The use of scripture gives a sense of spiritual authenticity, but exact quotations 15 years after the event is beyond implausible. There is no hedging the quotes to the best of his recollection or anything like that. He is quoting scripture and, in fact, rewriting some King James Version Bible verses to reinforce his narrative. It's my first time in some years reading through all this material, and I'm coming at it from a much more skeptical place. I'm definitely reading it differently, but it feels like I'm reading it more honestly now. That's it for this week. Thanks for listening. Please share with family and friends. Until next time.